You take a breath right now. You don't think about it. You never have to. But that breath came from somewhere. A tree, somewhere on Earth, made the oxygen molecule currently sitting in your lungs. Maybe it grew in Siberia. Maybe it grew in the Amazon. You'll never know which one. You never had to ask. Now imagine every single tree on the planet disappearing tonight. Not slowly, not over decades. Just gone, all 3 trillion of them, between one sunset and the next sunrise. What happens to you? What happens to the air, the rivers, the soil under your feet? The real answer is far stranger than suffocation and far faster than you think. Let's start with the myth. Most people assume the immediate danger is that you'd run out of oxygen. You wouldn't, not right away. The atmosphere holds a staggering surplus of oxygen built up over hundreds of millions of years. Even if every tree vanished overnight, you'd still have breathable air for generations. That's the twist nobody expects. The real killer isn't oxygen. It's everything else trees were quietly doing while you weren't paying attention. Start with water. A single mature tree can move hundreds of liters of water from the ground into the air every single day through a process called transpiration, water evaporating from its leaves like a slow, continuous exhale. Multiply that by trillions of trees, and you get something enormous. Forests don't just sit near rivers, they help make rivers. They pull moisture from the ocean, pump it inland, and release it again, creating rain hundreds of miles from any coastline. Climate researcher Antonio Donato Nobre, who spent decades studying the Amazon at Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, called this the flying rivers effect. Without it, entire continents dry out from the inside, so picture it, the trees are gone. Within weeks, rainfall patterns that took millennia to stabilize begin to collapse. Regions that depended on forest-generated rain, deep in Africa, deep in South America, deep in Southeast Asia, start sliding toward drought. Not because the sky stopped working, because the pump that fed the sky stopped working first, then the ground itself starts to fail. Tree roots are not just anchors, they're an entire underground infrastructure. They hold soil in place against wind and rain. They feed a web of fungal threads that ecologist Suzanne Simard at the University of British Columbia spent her career mapping, an underground network she nicknamed the Wood Wide Web, through which trees share water, sugar, and even warning signals about insect attacks. Pull the trees out and that network collapses instantly. Soil that stayed put for centuries starts washing away in the first heavy rain. Mudslides increase, farmland erodes. The dirt under your feet becomes less reliable than it's ever been in human history. You'd feel the temperature change next. Forests act like the planet's air conditioning, shading the ground, releasing cooling moisture, absorbing sunlight that would otherwise bounce back and heat the atmosphere. Remove them and the land underneath starts absorbing and radiating far more heat. Cities already prone to heat waves would get hit harder, faster. Rural regions that never used to see extreme temperatures would start recording them regularly. This wouldn't take centuries. Researchers modeling large-scale deforestation impacts have found measurable regional warming within a matter of years, not generations. Here's the part that surprises people most. Carbon doesn't just stop being absorbed, it starts coming back out. Trees have been quietly locking carbon into their trunks, their roots, and the soil around them for thousands of years. When a forest dies and decomposes, all of that stored carbon doesn't vanish. It releases slowly if it rots, violently if it burns. Scientists studying the Amazon's tipping point, including Carlos Nobre, have warned that large-scale forest loss could flip vast regions from carbon sinks into carbon sources, adding to the very warming that then makes it harder for anything to regrow. It's a loop. Losing the forest doesn't just remove a shield, it adds a new source of the exact problem the shield was solving. What about the rivers themselves? You might picture a river as a fixed line on a map, something that exists independent of the land around it. It isn't. Rivers are fed by watersheds, and watersheds are held together by root systems that slow water down, letting it soak into the ground instead of rushing straight into a channel. Remove the trees and rainfall stops soaking in. It runs, fast, unfiltered, and all at once. Rivers that used to rise gradually after a storm would instead flash flood within hours. Then, just as fast, they'd run dry between storms, because the slow underground release that used to feed them through the dry season would no longer exist. You'd get both extremes at once. Too much water, then none at all, on a cycle that used to be gentle and is now violent. What about the ocean? It seems disconnected from a forest, separated by continents and coastlines, but rivers carry nutrients from forest soil out to sea, feeding coastal ecosystems that depend on that steady trickle of organic material. Cut the source, and coastal fisheries, already stressed by warming water, would lose another pillar holding them up. The forest you never think about turns out to be feeding an ocean. You also never think about through a chain so long you'd never trace it back on your own. What about food? You might think agriculture would be fine since crops aren't forests. But most of the world's farmland depends on rainfall patterns that forests help generate, on pollinators that live in or near forest edges, on soil that forests helped build over centuries. Yields would fall first in the regions most dependent on forest-driven rain. Then supply chains, already fragile, would strain under the pressure. You wouldn't starve tomorrow, but within a growing season or two, the price of basic food would tell you something had gone deeply wrong. And the animals? An estimated 80% of the world's land-based species live in forests. Remove the forest, and you don't just lose trees. You lose the insects that pollinate remaining plants, the birds that spread seeds, the predators that keep smaller populations in balance. Entire food webs unravel at once, not one species at a time, but all together, because they were never separate systems to begin with. They were one system wearing different faces. Think about what that actually means for a single afternoon. A bee doesn't know it's part of a forest, it just knows there's a flower, then another, and along the way, pollen moves from one plant to the next. Remove the forest and the bee's flight path collapses along with everything else that depended on it. The fruit tree 3 fields over, the crop planted with the assumption that pollinators would show up on schedule, the small mammal that ate that fruit, the larger predator that ate the small mammal. None of them read a map showing they were connected. They didn't need to. The connection was the forest itself, quietly running in the background the entire time. So how long would this take to truly hurt you? Not the oxygen collapse people picture in disaster movies. The real timeline looks more like this. Weeks for rainfall patterns to start shifting. Months for soil erosion and flooding to become a regular emergency. A year or two for food prices and water shortages to reach cities far from any forest that used to exist. A decade for global temperatures to climb measurably, driven partly by the carbon no longer being absorbed and now actively being released. You wouldn't die gasping for air. You'd watch slowly as the systems you never noticed, depending on, quietly stopped holding everything else together. And what about you specifically, the person living in a city, far from any wilderness? You might assume distance protects you. It doesn't, not fully. Urban trees do work you've never credited them for. They cool streets that would otherwise trap heat between concrete and asphalt, sometimes lowering local temperatures by several degrees. They filter particulates out of the air you breathe on your commute. Environmental health researchers studying urban tree canopy have linked its loss to measurable increases in heat-related illness and respiratory problems in the neighborhoods that lose it fastest. Remove every tree everywhere, and the city block outside your window stops being a slightly warmer, slightly dirtier version of the countryside. It becomes something closer to an oven with traffic running through it. There's a psychological cost too, one that's harder to measure but just as real. Studies on green space and mental health have repeatedly found that proximity to trees correlates with lower stress hormones, better mood, and faster recovery from mental fatigue. Take that away completely, everywhere, all at once, and you're not just losing rainfall and shade. You're losing one of the few environments the human brain still recognizes as safe, a holdover instinct from tens of thousands of years spent living inside forests before you ever lived inside a wall. Why does this feel so surprising? Because trees don't announce what they do. They don't have sirens or warning labels. A forest doesn't look like infrastructure. It looks like scenery. You walk past it the way you walk past a wall, assuming it's just there. Decorative, permanent, background. But scenery doesn't move water across continents. Scenery doesn't hold 1 trillion tons of carbon out of the sky. What you've been calling scenery this whole time was actually the machine keeping your climate, your rivers, and your food supply stable enough to build a civilization on top of